Hello, everybody. David Parsons here. I have another episode of The Nostalgia Trap for you. Thank you so much for being patient and hanging on for new episodes. I have been in the middle of moving from New York to California, as I mentioned on the last episode that I posted a couple months ago. But I'm getting settled slowly, starting to get rid of boxes and build IKEA furniture and get done with all that. I still don't have maximum employment. And that's something that I think will come with time. But I gave up all my jobs teaching in a million different places in New York, and it's kind of scary, but I'm getting settled here, and this is, I'm in Ventura, California, which is the place that many of you may know that I was raised, and coming back here and living back in the place that I grew up in is really, really weird, but it's given me the opportunity to connect with a lot of people, and I hope to talk to those people on the show, and today's guest is no exception. My guest today is Mikhail Gershovich. He is the academic director at Emerson College in Hollywood currently, and we talk a little bit about what Emerson College Hollywood is, or Emerson College LA, which is an extension of the Emerson College in Boston that some of you may know. But Mikhail is someone that I met in New York, my years there, and we discovered quite randomly. He was my boss at the Bernard L. Schwartz Communication Institute at Baruch College for several years, and we discovered very, very weirdly that we both spent a significant portion of our childhoods in Ventura County. So that common history kind of bonded us, and he tells me a lot about his early years, which were in the Soviet Union. He was raised for the first 8 years of his life in the Soviet Union, and eventually his family decided to defect, and he tells the whole story of how that happened and ended up in Ventura, California. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you do enjoy these episodes, and please consider donating to the show. And I want to thank the people that continue to donate to the Patreon. If you give me like $5 a month, we have bonus episodes and stuff like that. It would really help me out, especially right now as I figure out what the hell I'm doing out here. Go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap for all the information on how to do that. And thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is me talking with my good friend Mikhail Gershovich. So it's kind of perfect that you're one of the guests that is actually the first guest on the show since I moved to Ventura, California, because I want to give a little bit of history between you and I, Mikhail. The first time we met was through a writing fellowship that I got through the Graduate Center at CUNY when I was in New York.
And I hired you.
That's right. So I was interviewed by you. I guess that was the first time I met you, but I don't think we like discovered this common background
until
later. But I was stunned to learn, and it's a story I've told to many people, that I was like, I grew up in a small town. I mean, I think of it as a small town. I think it is a small town, Ventura, California, as I've shared on the show many times. And I just moved back there after 14 years in New York. But, I'm from there, and I didn't expect to meet anybody from there when I was in New York, but I discovered that the guy who hired me and, like, my boss at the job that I ended up at in New York and at Baruch College was Mikhail Gershovich, a guy who also spent a good portion of his childhood in Ventura County, and in Ventura, like, actually blocks from me.
Yeah.
And so I think that, like, you were in Montalvo when you were a kid? Is that right?
We went to the same high school.
You went to Boyna, right?
Boyna, yeah.
Did you graduate from Boyna?
I did. No, I graduated from Simi Valley High School.
Okay, so at some point you moved to Simi Valley.
10th grade, yeah.
So we'll get to Simi Valley, because I think a lot of people will know Simi Valley from the Rodney King case, which was probably... Did that happen while you were there?
I was in Santa Cruz at the time.
Okay. Did you go to UC Santa Cruz?
I did.
Oh, we're covering way too much territory.
I have a funny story about about Simi Valley and the Rodney King.
Rodney King thing?
Yeah, it's a funny story about that.
Okay, so you are not from... You're not even from America.
No, I'm from the Soviet Union.
From the Soviet, a country that doesn't even exist anymore.
I was born in Riga, Latvia.
And where's that?
That is in the middle of the Baltic states, so it's basically wedged between Estonia and Lithuania, and it's directly across the I don't know what it is, the bay or whatever it is, from Sweden. So there's like if you were to go directly south from the very tip of Sweden, you would end up in Riga, Latvia.
How old were you when your parents and you moved to the United States?
I was 8 years old.
So you remember the Soviet Union?
Very much so. So this was 1979 when we immigrated.
So, I mean, I don't even know where to begin with that, but what was it like?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it was, you know, for a long time, the only thing that I knew.
Yeah.
And one of the things that characterized it for me was this bizarre consciousness that I was Jewish. And what that meant was, in my family, it didn't mean we went to synagogue. It didn't mean we kept kosher. It didn't mean any of those things. It just meant that I couldn't tell people I was Jewish.
Right.
And if I told them I was Jewish, I would probably get beaten up or something.
Wow.
Which actually happened.
So wait, is it more like a social punishment for being Jewish, or are there like other ramifications as well?
Well, it was the kind of thing where in the Soviet Union, theoretically, everybody's equal. There's no religion. You know, everything's secular. But there's still a deep-seated, all the deep-seated prejudices, especially in Latvia, where I lived, where they were kind of, you know, Russia has a history of anti-Semitism. Latvia has a much more intense history of anti-Semitism than Russia. And they, in fact, close to where I lived, when we moved, was a forest where there were mass graves. World War II, where Germans took a bunch of people who lived around there and shot them and threw them in ditches. That was near where I lived. And my grandfather was a World War II veteran, and he was a staunch communist. And I heard lots of World War II stories, and I was kind of taught to be afraid of Germans. Actually.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. What was the attitude, if you remember at all, about the United States?
Well, interesting, because it was, in some ways, it was this kind of mysterious adversary.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was this site of fascinating culture and it was. I mean, I was very much conscious of the United States when I was there, and I remember being conscious of Disneyland because it was in some book that I had, and it was presented in the book as this mythical children's village that exists somewhere in the United States.
It actually kind of describes it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, my grandfather, when he came to visit us he lived until he was about 79. He lived in Riga the entire time. He came to the U.S. once in like 1987, and we took him to Disneyland, and he wept on It's a Small World because it's this incredible sort of, you know, manifestation of all the children in the world holding hands and singing.
It's like a global cosmopolitan
It's like a communist dream. It's like it's this realization of this communist ideal where everyone is living in harmony and you know, celebrating something. You know.
It's a Small World was the ride that my dad always wanted to go on in the afternoon because he could take a nap in it.
Right.
Because he was a tired dad at Disneyland, and it's like a 35-minute ride or a 25-minute ride. It's quiet, it's air conditioned,
right?
And they just sing the same song over and over again. The ultimate earworm.
Well, my grandfather was deeply moved by it.
Yeah, I mean, I could see being deeply moved by it. I mean, I think it's easy to be like dismissive of things like that, but then you hear a story like that, and you're like, I mean, it makes me wonder what you're watching on television when you're in the Soviet Union. Well, was there any access to American television?
There was, and it was usually cartoons. For me, it was cartoons.
Yeah, okay.
So what I remember watching Tom and Jerry cartoons.
Right.
And they came out rarely, and I remember watching Tom and Jerry, and it was very apolitical, so it was acceptable.
The mouse is an asshole. Yeah.
The cat chases the mouse. Yep. Very simple, kind of biological truth.
It really is itchy and scratchy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I remember that. I remember, of all things, what was that name of that show? It was with Hal Linden, and it was like a nature show. Mm-hmm. It was. It'll come to me eventually. But it was. But I remember watching. I remember watching Hal Linden, and then being struck that I recognized him on Barney Miller. Mm-hmm. And then my father-in-law actually directed Barney Miller, and that was a trip later in life when I met my wife and her father, and her father was one of the directors of Barney Miller and directed all the fish. That was kind of a weird
And you had access to Barney Miller in the Soviet Union?
No, that was here.
Okay.
Barney Miller, and didn't understand a single word. I had no idea what any of that was about.
So you grew up speaking Russian?
I grew up speaking Russian. I learned English when I immigrated to the United States.
Do you still speak Russian?
I do, with my parents.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I still speak Russian. I don't speak Russian. Russian's not my primary language.
Right.
English. I mean, I didn't just learn English and went and got a PhD in it.
Right.
And I still speak Russian with my parents. I have a cousin who lives in France, and he's an artist, and he comes out. He and I talk about all kinds of stuff, and my Russian improves tremendously because we talk about things I don't usually talk about.
I'm sure.
Russian. But yeah, so I came to the U.S. without any English. Maybe I knew like, what is your name? How do you do? Because it was an English textbook that my father had. And I remember very clearly moving to Ventura when I was 8, and our first place where we lived was the Circle W Motel on Main Street, which I don't think is there anymore. I think there's another motel in its place. But
there's a lot of like rundown motels.
It was one of those
down in the Midtown area of Ventura that people call no-tell motels, and it's like a lot of. There's a lot of crack cocaine and crystal meth. Whatever there is of that in Ventura today is located at those hotels. So you went from the Soviet Union to Ventura.
Well, sort of. We went from the Soviet Union to Vienna, Austria, where we spent 2 weeks, and that was my introduction to the West. And that's where I saw store shelves that had things on them. Like, wow, that was kind of a mind-blowing experience. And
so wait, do you look back at Soviet communism and what you lived under as like the way that many Americans imagine it as a place of like that you didn't have a lot of choice and
it's all about deprivation until it was deprivation unless you were able to hustle and get what you needed, which was the Soviet way of life. That was the people hustled. You would get things.
It's kind of weirdly the American way of life in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways, but they're like, look, you work in a warehouse, and one of the things that you store in your warehouse is sausage. And I work in a factory where I manufacture stuff, and I have access to metal. And you have a dacha, which is your summer house, and you want to build your kid a swing. And you and I talk, and I say, you know what? I can get you metal for your swing. What can you get me? He's like, well, I can get you sausage for the dinner table. Awesome. So I go to work. I managed to sneak out a couple of pieces of metal, stick in my 1969 Zhiguli, and bring it over to you, and then you hook me up with what you got, and that's how people lived.
That makes sense, actually.
Yeah. My father told me this story. My father ended up trading a bottle of vodka for a car, which is the most Soviet thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, my father.
I can imagine that car.
Traded a bottle of vodka for a Zaporozhets, which was like a souped up. It was like a Soviet Fiat or Citroen.
I didn't even know the Soviet Union produced cars.
They had their brands. They had Zaporozhets, they had Zhiguli, they had Chaika. They had a bunch of them. They were mostly knockoffs.
It makes me wonder if people have Russian cars in the United States, like as collector's items and at shows. I'm sure.
The Lada was, I think, had a moment in the United States, very briefly. Soviet car.
Wait, so why did your parents flee the Soviet Union, or at least come to the United States? What was the impetus behind that immigration?
Well, the simplest answer is they could.
Yeah.
And my father was not a fan of the Soviet system. He very much bucked against it. My grandfather was the opposite. My father and my grandfather, this is not his father, this is my mother's father, fought all the time. In 1978, 79, this organization called HIAS, which is the Hebrew International Aid Society, was sponsoring Jewish refugees in the United States. And so my father hooked that up and managed to do it so that we were booked to go to Israel from the Soviet Union, and instead of going to Israel, we went to Ventura. So my father hooked that up, and
so you could have been a settler in Israel.
I could have been.
That's
I remember
crazy.
very clearly, actually, when I was in Italy. So after Vienna, we went to Italy. Went to a place outside of Rome called Lodispoli, where we lived for like 2.5 months. Yep. Waiting to go to the next stage, which was to New York, and then from New York to California. And I guess we were waiting for sponsorship in the United States. I remember very clearly when it was time to get on the bus to go to the airport in Rome. my father was standing outside the bus with a map, and it was still dark. It was like 4 a.m, whatever. We're like trying to get to the airport early, and my father standing outside the bus. We hadn't boarded the bus, and he's standing by the bus with a map. And he's like, "Where's Ventura? I don't see Ventura on the map. What is this place we're going to that's not even on the map?" Then he found it. It was this great relief that there's Ventura.
So you were assigned to Ventura,
Yes.
essentially?
So the Jewish community of Ventura took us in. So the Temple Beth Torah in Ventura took in
Temple Beth Torah.
Temple Beth Torah. The synagogue of Ventura.
Yeah, the only one.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. Is it still the only one? I don't know.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, it's up there like off Kimball and
Like
Victoria.
Foothill,
Yeah. Every time I drive on Foothill, I pass there, and I always wonder, like, I'm like, oh, there's the temple, and there's a school. I think there's like an elementary school or preschool.
I did Hebrew school there.
And I'm always like, are there enough Jews in this town for that?
Well, there weren't that many.
I mean, there were a lot of Jews at Buena High School actually when I was there. I mean, obviously, like I'm like as goy as you could possibly be, but moving to New York educated me a lot about Judaism. Like I'd never seen. I mean, if you're in Ventura, California, you don't see Orthodox people. You don't see Hasids really.
I did see a Hasid hitchhiking by the entrance to the 101 on Main Street one time when I was probably.
Are you sure that wasn't like a hallucination?
No, most definitely. He's probably coming from here. He's probably going north from here.
I mean, Ventura has a kind of weird. I don't know. There's a weird hallucinatory element to Ventura, and I always feel like I will never be surprised by the things I'll see there. Like when I moved to New York, part of me was like kind of like bored of Ventura. I thought it was a boring place, and New York is where you see weirdos. But now, like with the benefit of time and coming back from New York, I'm like, this place is as weird as New York. I mean, it's weird. It's filled with really surreal characters, and California itself, Southern California itself, is just rife with that kind of stuff. So that must have been a culture clash for you.
Major. Yeah.
Were you happy about the move?
No. I mean, I didn't. I knew what I knew. I knew my life there, and I remember coming home from school. And I went to second grade, so I was 8, but I went to second grade because I started first grade. I finished first grade in Soviet Union, Riga, but you start school a bit later, so a year later. So I was a year older, and I remember coming home from school and just crying and being like, "Why did you have to bring me here? Like, why couldn't we have just stayed there?" It was a very strange experience. I remember walking into my classroom, not speaking any English, and seeing all these kids. And they all look different from one another, and that was a trip. Where in Riga, I was at a school that was segregated. It was half Latvian, half Russian speaking, and all the Latvian kids looked more or less the same, and all the Russian speaking kids looked more or less the same, and there was no diversity, and everyone looked exactly the same. They all had the same uniform, and everyone dressed the same, and then when I got to school. In Montalvo School in Ventura, I remember walking in and seeing kids. Not only were they dressed differently from one another, they all looked different. There was some black kids, there were some Asian kids, there were some Latino kids. It was very shocking.
Yeah.
And I actually
even in Ventura, which is not known for its cultural diversity,
right,
but seems so even more so than where you're from.
Right. There was a token everything, right? But the point is, it was far more diverse than I remember. I mean, that I was used to.
So that would have been the late 70s, early 80s that you're starting to go to school there.
Yeah. So I was in second grade at Mrs. Black at Montalvo School, and I didn't speak any English. And I used it to my advantage.
I think my brothers probably had her. I was only there at Montalvo. My brothers went to Montalvo, I think, for most of their elementary school, but I only went there for kindergarten.
Okay.
Where my teacher wouldn't tie my shoe because she told me that she was mean, and I had already learned. We'd already gone through that unit. I should know. So my brother, who was in 5th grade, used to come by, like at lunchtime, and I would stick my feet through the chain link fence, like we're in a prison camp, and he would tie my shoe for me. Yep. That's my one memory.
Gave you a carton of cigarettes.
Montalvo's, carton of cigarettes. We traded vodka and car.
Yeah.
So that's Montalvo. I mean, Montalvo is a very it's a poor place. Like Montalvo is a
very heavily Mexican place.
Yeah, it's not even like I don't think it's incorporated. I don't think it's really part of the town. if anyone, for people that aren't from Ventura, don't know this place, Ventura is, mostly just like it's really suburban these days. But Montalvo remains this kind of like slice out of a previous era. There's like there's a railroad depot down there, and like it feels very like Jack Kerouac. Like there's like some coffee houses that look like they've been there for 70 years. And that's where you grew up?
Yeah. That mini mall on Bristol with the 7-Eleven and the liquor store.
Yeah.
I went, played Donkey Kong there, and
I used to
go there. I used to buy candy.
Did they have arcade games in that 7-Eleven?
They did. They had for a long time they had like Missile Command and Donkey Kong. I'd play that. I would go down there. I would find change in the house, and I would go and I'd buy a big gulp at the 7-Eleven, and I'd go.
So you must have been charmed by the American culture, or at least the like ridiculous element of consumption that American culture gives you.
No, it was great. It was variety, and I mean, part of it, I'm sort of a kind of a scholar by nature, so I want to categorize, and I want to like make distinctions, and I want to create a taxonomy. And for me, like that was like super interesting to see all the different kinds of candy bars and all the comic books and all these different things that just didn't exist. And I got a taste of that in Italy when we were there. But this is very different. And I actually, eventually learned English, so I was able to relate to that much more than when I was in Italy.
So wait, where'd you go to middle school then?
I went to middle school at Anacapa.
Yep.
Middle school. 6th through 8th grade. And in 7th grade, I moved up to 8th grade.
Well, it's weird. I mean, we bring this up on the show all the time. Like the history of the 1980s is a very specific kind of history in the United States relating to the Soviet Union, and so you're like on the other side of that now. As you're coming of age, literally, like the United States is engaged in, like a new era of the Cold War with Reagan and Gorbachev. Like, was that something that was talked about in your house?
Not in my house, but at school for sure.
Yeah.
So I remember the anxiety around nuclear war at that point.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember what year Day After came out. It was maybe 84, 85?
I want to say, 83 or 84.
Something like that. And I remember
the one the Day After, is that the one that's like a fake newscast? That's kind of like a newscast of that's meant to like almost feel like it's a real. Is that the one I'm talking about?
I don't remember that part. Maybe that's an element of it, but it's the one. So there were two movies that came out around the same time. One was called Threads. It was an English film. It was BBC film about basically the same plot. So nuclear war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and in the British one in Threads, in the end, everything disappears. Language disappears. Human decency disappears. There's no hope. It's just nuclear devastation means the end of humanity.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
But in The Day After, if you remember, there's that scene in the end where Jason Robards goes to the site of where his house was, and his hair's falling out and he's all bloody. And he gets to the crater that is where his house was, and there's a family huddling in the crater, and he yells at them, "Get out of my house! Get out of my house!" and the movie ends with the man handing him an orange. He hands him an orange, and they embrace, and then this wide shot. The movie ends, and that was this kind of bizarre, hopeful kind of
Jesus Christ.
Humanity still exists, and that was the weird subtext of all that stuff. It's like, Russia might destroy us, but ultimately you're okay because you're just like us. And the subtext of that, and this is an interesting thing, is that there's the kind of so my story, my Soviet story, my immigration story, and it's a story of lots of other Soviet immigrants. It's particularly compelling to a lot of Americans, especially of our age. And I think the reason it's so compelling is that these are immigrants to whom white people can relate because they're white, and they look more or less, and they have middle class values, and they're educated, and they're more or less like us. But they come from this bizarre system that they fled. I always thought of the Soviet Union. I still think of Russia as kind of like this dark mirror of the United States. Like we're buddies, man. We're cousins. Where the reason why we clash is because I think of
I don't know, poverty and poor people in Russia as very similar to poor people in the United States, like culturally, values-wise. I mean, there's a lot going on there that's similar. And yeah, whiteness has a lot to do with it too.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, there are kids who immigrated from, let's say, Southeast Asia, Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam.
At the same time.
Yep. Who literally ran through rice paddies, gunfire, and, all kinds of mines exploding to make it across the border to make it to, wherever so they can make it to the United States.
Orange County,
right. And that's not as compelling of a story as the Russian immigrant story, because there's that disconnect for a lot of Americans.
That's only a in my experience culturally, that's only a compelling experience when there's like a white guy that like gets with a Vietnamese immigrant girl and they like start a family. You can make an interesting movie about that. But
right.
I mean, when I think of 1980s movies, Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States relationship was like kind of a central. They were the bad guys in all the movies. And I think of like War Games and Rocky IV, which I think was like 1985 or somewhere in there.
Red Dawn.
Red Dawn. Yeah, and you saw that at Fox Theater.
Yeah, Ventura.
Fox Theater is right across from the Ventura Mall. Red Dawn must have been a trip.
Yeah, it was a trip. I remember my father walking out of there saying, like, "What the hell did I just see?" And the thing,
isn't Patrick Swayze?
Patrick Swayze, C. Thomas Howell.
Yep.
Powers Booth.
Oh yeah, rest in peace. He just died.
Yeah. Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Leah Thompson.
I'm
trying to think who else was in that movie. Maybe was Charlie Sheen in that movie?
I don't remember.
Wolverines.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I remember seeing that there, and I remember my father being really kind of perturbed by it because of the representation of Soviets. And the thing that always got us were the fake Russian accents.
Yeah.
So, I mean, now you don't really see that as much because there's a lot of Russian actors that are working. But at that time, the fake Russian accents, like, just go to Fairfax, find a real
I would
Russian.
think the accent would be the least of the kind of issues you might have with that movie. I mean, it's weird because when I think back on it, I mean, I watching those movies, particularly like Top Gun and Rocky IV, you talk about like the Russian people versus like the state, and like these states, it's really like the states that are warring at this point in the Cold War. I didn't really think of Russian people. I thought more of like just militarized. Droids basically. Right. Like I mean, I remember thinking that is it Drago? Is that his name?
Yeah, Drago.
And that
I must break you.
Yes, yeah. I remember thinking when I was a kid that he was a robot. Like I wasn't sure. I don't think I read the movie well, and I kind of thought that this was a robot, like a robotic creature made by the Soviets. And it's weird to think of how deep the politics went, but we were not really old enough to understand them.
Yeah. Well, it's also a weird thing because he was played by a Swedish actor.
That's right? Dolph Lundgren.
Who was this Aryan, sculpted Aryan, right? And that's not what Rocky's Russian opponent would look like,
right?
Rocky's Russian opponent would be a big, hairy, fat dude,
yeah, right,
who would not be that kind of.
It'd look like Butterbean,
right?
Yeah,
right.
Something like that.
Yeah, and just that kind of. That characterization of that kind of ideological hatred of the West. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, I think it's a fiction of U.S. popular culture.
Yeah,
honestly.
Of course.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because in the Soviet Union there wasn't that kind of hatred for America. There was definitely a certain disdain. My grandfather, for example, a certain disdain for American politics. Mm-hmm. I remember Jimmy Carter being demonized. I actually remember very clearly being in Riga and wanting to see Jimmy Carter on TV. And I remember, trying to stall my bedtime and coming out and be like, I want to see Jimmy Carter. Like, oh, there he is. Go to bed. So, yeah, I remember that pretty clearly. But at the same time, there was this deep fascination with American culture. My father very much had it. My father kept talking about, and he still talks about, going to some American exposition in Moscow. Yeah. That, where he heard the Beatles for the first time. He saw American cars. He saw blue jeans. He saw all this stuff, and he and Russians of Soviets of his generation had this deep fascination with Western culture, with American popular culture, and we'll claim the Beatles, even though they're British.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, that kind of fascination with the West, the sort of cosmopolitan kind of desire to experience something that on the one hand is forbidden, but then deeply, deeply compelling, and that was a thing in Russia.
It's funny because you hear about. I mean, I remember, and I think it's still there. This mythology about the collapse of communism being like, well, you know, the Soviets wanted blue jeans and Billy Joel music and Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. And I always thought, like, I was always suspicious of that. I always thought, like, well, you know, that's probably a simple story that Americans tell to pat themselves on the back. But, I mean, there is an element of, like, an overwhelming power to America, which actually is even, I mean, it doesn't really contradict, like, ideas about capitalism in terms of this, like, overarching, intense power of attraction, right? That has, like, I don't know, I think about, I don't think it's a apocryphal story. I think it's real that, like, Boris Yeltsin went to an American supermarket and, like, was crying in there basically, and was like, we all had that experience. I think that was the end of communism for me.
No, look, I remember walking into a supermarket and I remember just being struck by just the variety of stuff. And there's that scene, you saw Moscow on the Hudson, which came out, I think, also in 1984. It was a Robin Williams film where he plays a Russian immigrant. He's a circus performer who defects in New York.
And was this like cultural propaganda in some ways?
In some ways, it was. Like it. Yeah. So the plot of this film is he is a circus saxophonist who is
circuses have saxophonists.
Well, yes, he was a saxophonist in the circus, and circus is a rich, Russian tradition of circus.
Sure.
And he was a saxophonist in the circus, and he was deeply in love with was it Ornette Coleman and so Hawkins, I can't remember the first name, and he has this fascination for American culture, and they take a trip to New York, and there's two Russian actors that were in the film. One was I can't remember his first name. The last name was Kramarov. Who's kind of a prolific Russian actor in American movies. He was always a bit actor, but he's recognizable. And then Ilya Baskin, who was another one who was, I think, from Riga. And Ilya Baskin, he was one of the bad guys in Air Force One. He's recognizable. If you saw him, you'd recognize him. And they were kind of like they were sort of the bad guys that are trying to keep him from defecting. Robin Williams defects, and he's kind of brought in by this African American guy who takes him into his house. That was Ernie Hudson, I think. Plays that
makes sense.
And then his love interest is Maria Conchita Alonso. I don't know whatever happened to her.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a propagandistic story, but it's this. It kind of fetishizes America as this ideal and kind of shows Russians as these people who have this deep longing for what they've been deprived of.
They didn't know that they wanted to be American deep down.
And there's a scene in that movie where he walks into a supermarket and he walks into the coffee. He's supposed to buy coffee, and he walks into the coffee aisle and he sees a can of coffee. He sees another can of coffee, and then he has this. Starts saying coffee, and everything just starts spinning, and he passes out.
Yeah,
because he's overwhelmed by the variety of coffee.
I see. So Robin Williams is doing like a Russian accent in this movie.
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah,
I can imagine.
But he's appropriately hairy and
bearded. At least he's swarthy enough. Yeah, got it. You know, it's funny because like walking through grocery stores in suburban Ventura now, I mean, after having lived in New York for a long time, it's a little version of this, like in terms of like big giant supermarkets where you have like the salad dressing aisle is like a whole aisle, and there are 50,000 salad dressings. Yeah. And like I don't know, I think it's easy to be like, well, that's amazing and that's so great, but there's another level to that. It's kind of like, well, how is this all made? Like, how is this possible? Yeah. And once you start to think about how it's possible, that's like another level of like political development.
We used to I guess troll my grandfather all the time by sending photos. Like there's a photo of me at age 8 standing in the fish aisle at a supermarket, whatever it was in the supermarket, holding a big giant fish in a plastic wrapper. And we sent that to my grandfather, like, look, America.
Yeah, fuck you. We got a giant fish. That's amazing. So, I mean, how did you relate to your grandfather? Like, did you go back ever?
Yeah, I did go back.
Did he come to the United States?
He did. He came. So when I was in high school, he came. He came in 1987, in my first year in Simi Valley High, after my parents moved there.
Yep.
And then I saw him again in 1995, which was the year that, or 94, and then he died in 1995. But when he came to the U.S., this is a really interesting moment for me where we picked him up from the airport and we took him home, and he has one suitcase. And he opened the suitcase, and in the suitcase was one pair of underwear. And naively, I'm like, grandfather, you didn't bring anything. But the whole point was that he would load up the suitcase on the way back.
Right.
And that's what Russians of his generation, or Soviets of his generation, would do when they came to visit family who had immigrated around the same time we did, is they call them vacuums, because they would just buy up all the stuff.
Loot the shit.
Totally.
Yeah.
And like we sent him back with this like Puma tracksuit and a leather coat and a PAL VCR and like all this stuff. And he left.
He must have been a god when he got back.
Oh my God, completely. And when he got back, he sort of complained that we showed him America from like the parade route. Like we should, like, it's like that. What's that street in East Berlin where that's like everything's all pretty? But then you just go out, it's like, so like, where did you want us to take you? Like South Central? Like,
right. You want to see the poverty?
Right. Exactly. But yeah. So and he never.
So did he mean when he said that? Did he mean like you kind of cheated?
Kind of.
Like you cheated. You showed me in like basically propaganda.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Which
take
was
you to
interesting.
Disneyland, take you to the mall.
Right.
Don't show you behind the mall.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But we showed him how we lived. I mean, this is, we had at that time we lived in Simi Valley. My parents had a decent house, 2-car garage, living in the burbs.
Why'd you move to Simi Valley?
My father got a job in the San Fernando Valley.
Okay.
And we lived in Ventura.
That's closer. Yeah.
And so they moved to Simi Valley in 1987. My parents still live in that house.
Wow.
And I was just there. And so that was then, and that was interesting. What struck me was the difference between Simi Valley and Ventura, because Ventura is kind of a self-contained little town.
Yes.
It doesn't really depend on anything around it, really. I mean, sort of.
Right.
But would you say that Ventura somehow depended on LA? I mean, not.
No.
It's its own industry,
It's its
right?
own. Yeah, it's its own place.
Yeah,
there are people that commute, I think, but I don't know. I think most people in Ventura work in Ventura or somewhere in the county.
Because it's 50 miles from here. So
I don't know. I mean, when I think of Simi Valley, I don't know Simi Valley that well. I really think of it probably the same way that people nationally think of Simi Valley, because of the this place where the Rodney King trial was moved from L.A.
Moved there for a reason.
But I think of Simi Valley as a very like white suburban place.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's a white suburban place that has a weird relationship to the valley just over the hill.
Yes.
On the one hand, and then Thousand Oaks and Newbury Park on the other end.
Yep.
And we lived on the east side of Simi Valley, so we lived closer to the 118, which took us to right over the
Ronald Reagan Highway. Now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we took my grandfather to the Reagan Library, which was there at the time. I think it was open then. But yeah, so Simi Valley felt like a bedroom community.
Yeah.
And there was not much there. There wasn't really a downtown. There was just a lot of kind of sprawl. But Ventura had a downtown. It felt like a little city. It had its own various scenes.
Yes.
And it culturally was very different from Simi Valley.
Did you go back to Ventura? Do you have friends there?
Yeah.
So when you're in high school, was your cultural where was your scene in high school? What were you doing?
I finished 10th grade at Buena. My parents. My mom still worked in Ventura, and we commuted from Simi Valley to Ventura.
Wow.
For, I don't know, a few months.
Yeah.
Maybe like 3 or 4 months. And then I still stayed in touch with my high school friends at Buena. And I was very much close to them. And then I got the hell out of Simi Valley as quickly as I could after I graduated.
Well, before we get to that, I mean, what kind of student were you in high school?
I was a terrible student.
Why? Why were you a terrible student?
I was a terrible student because in the very beginning, this is sort of my read on it. In the very beginning, I was lazy because I wasn't particularly stimulated. And rather than find stimulation on my own, I started just kind of slacking.
Yeah.
So I remember using my lack of English as an excuse to like sit in the back of the classroom and look at the old National Geographics from the 40s that were in the closet. I remember that kind of stuff. So until I had a affirmative grasp of English, I kind of used it to my advantage to use the teacher's bathroom. Right. So like I would go use the teacher's bathroom and the teacher would walk in on me and I'd be sitting there and be like, I don't speak any English. Like, oh, okay. And it would leave me. So I
but
like,
you
for a
did
year.
You had to have spoken
yeah,
English.
but at that point I kind of.
You like? Did you have a heavy accent?
I had a pretty heavy accent until probably for a year. There was one of the.
Because you have like no trace of an accent now.
Well, not anymore because I was of the right age.
Yeah.
So if I was a year older, I'd still have an accent.
Interesting.
So your linguistic habits form around the age of 9 or 10. When you're kind of muscle memory and stuff.
It sounds like you were alienated in high school.
Well, high school,
it's hard not to be alienated.
Yeah,
in high school,
I was no more alienated than anybody else. I mean,
right.
I wasn't. My social skills weren't the best in high school. I kind of had my little crew and hung with them and kind of dorky kids and the level of kind of engagement and instruction in most European countries is much more serious than in the U.S. So I was doing stuff in second grade that I knew left and right, and I actually fell behind in third grade because I was bored and didn't want to do the math because it was just too easy. I didn't want to do it, and then by the time I had to do it, was just too much of it to get done in time. And I remember having this crisis where the teacher's like, "You're going to fail third grade because you do the math."
So did you get bad grades in high school?
I got okay grades in high school. I got B's, some C's. My parents were really upset about it. My parents were like, sort of those parents where if you don't get an A or.
Do you have siblings?
No, only child.
Only child.
Yep.
Oh, that explains so much.
Yeah, there's that.
Holy shit.
There's that. Yeah, and it wasn't really until college that I became interested and I wanted to learn. And part of it was that just availability of stuff. Like I remember looking at the college catalog, and I went to Moore Park, so I was too shitty of a student.
Very close by.
Very close by. It was
part of the Ventura County Community College District.
Right.
I have to mention the reason why I'm in the county now is because my wife got a job at Oxnard College, which is another campus within that district. And Moore Park College is known for a lot of things, but the thing I think it's most known for is its like zoological program.
Yeah, exotic.
There's monkeys there.
Yeah,
they've
exotic
got
animal training and management. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And in high school, they, at Buena, they took us on a field trip to Moore Park to show us the, howler monkeys and all this crazy shit. And I remember being there and going to a lecture, with a chemistry professor who mentioned in his lecture that. The type of explosion and chemical the reaction that he was describing was something that was used this morning at a bomb in Oklahoma City. And so I know that April 19th, 1995 was the date of the field trip there was no internet. Wow. So in other words, we heard about the Oklahoma City bombing from this teacher who just kind of mentioned it like, hey, this happened, and knew that we didn't know. And for me, it's a big moment of thinking about like media and how that works.
Yeah.
So either way, Moore Park College.
Yeah, EATM, the Exotic Animal Training and Management Program.
Yeah,
EATM, call EATM. We hear lions.
But you weren't part of that.
No, I wasn't part of that. I got into the humanities there, so I got into philosophy and literature, and for me, it was just the breadth of stuff I could take, and it was finally exciting and stimulating. Where I'm really good at Cali, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this.
Were you a reader?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, a little bit. Not, I wasn't one of these kids that's kind of sat for hours and hours and hours, but I was definitely interested.
I kind of want to go back to high school because culturally, like what kind of music are you listening to? Or is there anything going on in high school, or is it something you discover in college, skateboarding and that kind of stuff? Because I feel like there's a strong current in Ventura County. Mm-hmm. I don't know about Simi Valley, but a strong current in Ventura County of like skating, surfing, stoners, punks. I mean, we were talking before we started this about like the Nardcore scene, which is a pretty well-known punk scene coming out of Oxnard, California. Was that stuff that you were involved in or around at all, or is it kind of tangential? I mean, for me, I was younger, and I feel like it was stuff that like my brothers might have been around, and I didn't really get involved with it that much. I think I mentioned to you that my parents forbid me from going to the Ventura Theater because it was a place where goths and punks hung out. And there was like a coffee shop down there called the Daily Grind where a bunch of kids that looked like they were from The Cure were hanging out there, and it was
Right.
horrifying to the parents. But were you? What was your cultural orientation in high school and college?
Well, in the beginning, I was sort of, I had a weird relationship to that stuff because it was so far from what I was exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this one moment where, I kind of remember where there was a rift between my parents and me. It was 1981. And we listened to the same. It was the Mighty 690, which was do you remember that station?
Yeah.
So this is like a border blaster radio station in Tijuana
Yep.
that we got in Ventura.
The Mighty 690. Wow.
690 AM.
Yeah.
And they played like top 40 hits. And I remember listening to that in the car with my parents all the time. And whenever we'd go anywhere, my parents would put on the Mighty 690, and we heard like Blondie and they played Flock of Seagulls and like all that stuff. And the interesting kind of split that happened between me and my parents in terms of popular culture was when MTV came around.
Yeah.
And my parents saw what the artists that they were listening to looked like.
Yeah.
And they were freaked out.
Yes.
Because people weren't supposed to look like that.
Yeah.
Right. And I was young enough where it was like cool. See Boy George, like that's something really fascinating about Boy George.
I was thinking of Boy George when you were saying that, because that was, that was the moment for me of seeing Boy George on TV. Kind of blew my mind when I was young.
Right? Because you haven't seen anything like that.
Yep. Annie Lennox.
Annie Lennox, yeah. I mean, the whole androgyny thing.
Yes.
I mean, that was new. But I was a little too young, maybe just by a few years to get into the nerdcore stuff. But I also, at the time, it didn't really appeal to me, partially because there was something really chaotic about it that I couldn't really get my head around. And all the kids that were into it were kind of, there was a certain like exclusionary thing. They're all like the dirt punks.
Yeah, totally.
But then, later on, when I got a little bit older, I became more interested in that stuff, and I was sort of, I was like the kid in the punk rock cliche of the kid that doesn't look like he belongs at a punk show, right? So I was like that. I was interested in that stuff, and I had friends who were into it, and when I was in Wayne, I had this lab partner. Her name was Kathy Wigton. I wonder if Kathy's still around. Kathy was a mod, and she was into the specials, and she was into the jam.
Oh, the specials.
Yeah, and she got me.
Ska scene.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. She got me into that. She got me into the mod stuff, to the jam, and then from there it was like the Clash, and then it was the Sex Pistols, and then got into the American stuff. I got into the Minutemen, and then Minor Threat, Fugazi, that kind of stuff. I was a little bit older. Yeah. But by the time I was in my freshman in college, I was pretty heavy into that stuff. But in high school, I was listening to a lot of classic rock. I liked the jam. I liked the specials, but there's no radio play of that stuff. Like that was all stuff you can get to buy
I think like Madness had Madness, like a few hits.
Yeah, Madness. Remember listening to Madness?
Is it Our House in the Middle of the
Street?
Street?
That was the hit. There's like the Nightboat to Cairo
and One Step Beyond.
One Step Beyond.
Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
So you mentioned Salzer's just now. I mean, did you go to Salzer's when you were young?
I went to Salzer's.
So Salzer's is a place that I honestly don't know how the video store is still open.
Really?
And they're renting VHS, like just tons of old VHS. Salzer's is like, there is this massive record store. It's a big place. It's like two stories, and it's still there. And it's still, if you go inside, it's kind of modern in the sense of like it's like a gift shop now. They have like they sell bongs and they sell stuff like that, but they also sell like, you can get all sorts of like I don't know, like counterculture novelties there.
Yeah.
But they also they'll still buy CDs from you there. Like they're still doing the whole like, go talk to like a stoned long-haired dude in a tank top, and he'll look at your CDs and like appraise them and give you cash for them, which was a major way for me to make a few bucks when I was younger, was to go sell CDs at Salzer's.
It's amazing it's still there.
It's really crazy. And the video store, I worked at the video store when I was in my 20s, saving money for graduate school to go. to New York. I got an extra job at Salzer's. I thought it would be easy. And it was, but it's weird because they still have like on Mondays, it's a 2-for-1 to rent adult videotapes. And so there would be a line on Monday morning before we open. Like I would come open the store with a key, and there'd be like a line of old men outside the store who were waiting to like return their 10 videotapes, because you were allowed to rent 5 and get 5 for free. That was 10 was the max. and they were there to like turn in their 10 and get their new 10. And I had to like talk to these guys about, often they'd ask me like, you know, look up their rental history to tell them if they didn't want to rent ones that they'd seen before. And and that was my job on the way to graduate school. You went to graduate school.
Uh-huh.
You went to CUNY,
same
graduate
school you
center,
went to, yeah.
Same one I went to. But how did you end up there from Moore Park College? Like, and when you graduate Moore Park College, where did you do a 4-year? Where did you go from there?
Well, so after Moore Park, I went to Santa Cruz.
Okay.
So I did 2 years at Santa Cruz, which is where I met my wife.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Jane and I met in at Santa Cruz, and then after Santa Cruz, I moved to Boston.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Northeastern for a couple of years for my master's, and I taught there for 2 years after that. So I had a full-time gig after I graduated. I was a lecturer at Northeastern, and then I got into CUNY, and then we moved to New York.
So at what point does like teaching become something that you're doing? I mean, you go to UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
I mean, was that ever? When I look back on it now, I think there's like it kind of makes sense that I ended up like teaching American history. I can kind of see it and know that there was like something deep down in me but I never had like the professed goal of like I'm going to teach American history. It just ended up that way, and now it makes sense to me in retrospect. At what point does like teaching enter your mindscape of possibilities?
Well, I always thought that I kind of wanted to teach, just because it seemed like a thing that I could do, and I tutored a lot when I was at Moore Park, and then I was in an American literature course at Santa Cruz, and it was a big class, like a couple hundred students, but it had discussion sections, and I at one point was hitchhiking on campus, and I was picked up by my TA. And my TA said, "Do you want my job next year?" I said, "Absolutely." So the first class I ever taught, I taught as an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz.
Wow!
I led a discussion section in Paul Skenazy's 20th Century American Lit class, and I just really dug it. I mean, there was something about it that I was good at. Like I kind of I was able to relate to the students in a certain way, and was able to kind of navigate the material. And then when I moved to Boston, teaching was part of my package at Northeastern, and
you were in a master's program for English.
In literature, and I kind of found that I was pretty good at it. Like I was able to do it passably, and no one thought I was a fraud. So. And then I started teaching from there, and I taught a lot at Northeastern. And I taught. I was in the quarter system, so I would have like 4, 4, and 4. Yeah. And then I taught at Baruch when I moved to New York, and then continued. I was at Schwartz. So when the job I had before I had this job, I taught occasionally. So the last class I taught was in 2013.
So you haven't taught for like 4 years.
Yeah, at some point I'll teach here
at
Emerson, Los Angeles. But
do you miss it?
At this point, I miss it. Because
this is my first semester not teaching.
It's weird,
in 12 years.
It's weird,
and it's September something, and it feels really weird. And seeing like all my friends on social media, and my wife has started teaching. She's teaching 4 classes. She's talking about her students all the time. And it feels there's some I'm not bereft, but there's something I feel weird about. I want to get back to that.
Yeah, no, I do. I definitely do miss it, and I think a lot about what I would teach here.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'm just kind of happy being like the head of the faculty, which is ironic because I'm not a faculty. I'm not teaching here, but yet faculty report.
You're the academic director at Emerson College.
I am, Los Angeles.
Yeah, which is
semester away program for Emerson College.
Say that again.
So
what is this place? Like when you told me, because I mean we worked together in New York for several years, and then you broke everybody's heart at the Schwartz Institute, and I am not exaggerating that at all. When you announced that you were leaving,
thank you.
Everyone was bereft. And you came to Emerson. You didn't come immediately to Emerson.
No, I bounced around for about a year and a half.
You moved because your wife got a job.
My wife got a job,
like me.
Yep, just like you.
Yeah.
And it was this great moment in July of 2013 where I didn't have to really be anywhere and I could just explore LA and
enjoy being marginally employed
exactly.
or unemployed. In
I was very
California.
marginally employed at that point, still consulting for Baruch.
Yep.
And then at one point in 2014, as this building was coming up, this is a crazy building.
It is.
Like Tom Main.
It looks like the new Cooper Union building in the Village in New York.
I wonder if he designed it too.
Yeah,
that's possible.
It looks like a moon prison.
Yeah, well, some students have called it future spaceship prison hotel or something like that.
Yeah.
And I remember
some of
walking,
those words are positive.
Yeah, I remember walking past this building before it was open on the way to the cantina where you and I met today.
Yep.
Thinking, wow, Emerson College has a campus in LA. That'd be cool to work there. And then,
here you
a
are.
year later, I got this gig.
Well, I want to go back to the UC thing real quick because the UC model that you started out being like a TA in the section. I mean, I think that's pretty much like standard across the whole UC system, right? Over? Yeah, where it was like you had a lecture, especially in your undergrad, or especially in like the like general ed, the first 2 years. I was in classes that had like 500 people in them, and there'd be like some superstar lecturer, and you'd come and listen to them, and there was no interaction with that professor at all. And then the rest of the week, you'd go to sections where you would meet with a TA or a graduate student, basically, who I knew they were involved in like all sorts of labor disputes because they were always going on strike and things like that. So that was my first introduction to kind of like the adjunct world. But either way, you like kind of like listen to these lectures, and then you go and do these sections with like a smaller amount of students and a graduate student that's kind of leading it. What do you think of that model? After teaching for many years at CUNY, I kind of like that model.
Yeah. Yeah,
there's something about it for everyone. If everyone were paid well, it seems like a good one.
I never taught a course like that though. I every course I ever taught was maximum of like 25 students.
Yeah,
I never taught like a large course with breakout sections. I never had a TA.
Yeah. Well, they don't do that very much at CUNY.
No, not like we know it. I mean, they have their own version of it. But yeah, it's an interesting model, and it was. The lectures were interesting and compelling, and then you got to really kind of dig into stuff in the discussion sections, and that's where you form the relationships with your classmates and your TA, and I liked it. And all my TAs were all grad students.
Yeah.
And I remember when they unionized and they joined the UAW.
Yep,
and
that's right.
And I remember that. I can't remember her name, but one of my TAs was like right there on the picket line with the thing. I remember kind of admiring that. And thinking it was interesting. And
yeah, I mean, it was kind of like a step towards being more politically aware and being more aware of certainly the politics of college campuses.
Yeah.
I mean, as a Californian now, I mean, you feel like a Californian, I think, probably by the time you're in high school or college.
Probably.
Your accent is fading at that point.
But there's a fairly sizable number of people.
Yes.
In the United States and in Canada.
Yes.
For whom I am the quintessential New York Jew.
Right.
Which I think is is really funny.
Well, when I first met you, and I didn't know you were from, Ventura A, or Soviet Union B, right? I didn't know those things about you. And I didn't know the Jewish thing either. But I thought you were a very, very New York figure.
Yeah. Well, I felt very New York at the time. New York at that time was.
You reminded me of like you're a Julian Schnabel-esque figure. Yeah, and I mean that in the best way. Not the pajamas or anything, but East Coast.
Yeah.
Why did you come to the East Coast? Were you interested in?
Yeah. What for me
that experience? I know I had my own reasons of going to the East Coast. I associated the East Coast with where smart people were,
right?
Kind of, and like that's where you go to be like sophisticated and literary. Was that something that you had in your mind when you applied to go?
Yeah. I wanted to live in a city that wasn't like this, like a big sprawling place. I wanted a vertical city.
Yeah. Me too.
And a
lot of Hollywood movies about like living up in those penthouses.
And to me, which is really now kind of odd and ironic, but to me, that was quintessentially America. So the thing about the East Coast and the Midwest, that was American in a way that Southern California wasn't. And now that I'm back here, and I'm thinking like that's really strange because you can't. This is kind of the essence of America for me now. Like just this bizarre place.
Well, we're sitting in a room that you can basically step outside, and the Hollywood sign is looming above us. We're on Sunset Boulevard, kind of in the middle of it all. It's a surreal kind of place.
It really is. It really is.
It feels both like really, really fake and the most authentic American place you could ever be.
That's right. And I didn't appreciate that at the time. And now that makes a lot of sense to me.
Do you miss the East Coast? Do you miss New York?
I miss some things. I miss my friends on the many of whom you know.
Yeah.
I miss that. In some ways, I miss what we had at Schwartz, which I think was an interesting moment.
It was
in CUNY history.
I've talked about it on the show before. A very rich intellectual environment there for a few years.
Absolutely, and I missed that. And also when you're in a job for 10 years, you kind of forget that you had to earn it. Like you had to earn trust, right? Yep. And so when I left, I was really well established, and I had a good amount of influence and power and a giant budget, and I took that for granted at the time. And now, having kind of working to build that back up again in a very different environment, I can look back on that and interesting moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have kind of an insane story and a very deeply American story, and one that comes out of the 80s and connects so strangely. I mean, it still trips me out to think about that I was a little kid and you were a kid in the same environment, very blocks away from each other, and we wouldn't meet for decades later in an office associated with our jobs in New York City.
Yeah, that was very bizarre. I remember when you told me you were from Ventura. I'm like, wait, what? You're from where?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's bizarre. Yeah. Mikhail, thanks so much for talking. I appreciate it.
I have there's one more story I want to tell.
Please.
May I? This is probably earlier in the podcast.
We got time.
So Santa Cruz.
Yes.
I have this memory from Santa Cruz where it was during the Rodney King. It was after the verdict came down.
So you were at UC Santa Cruz when that happened?
I was in UC Santa Cruz when that happened.
And this is 1992.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was living in the dorms. I was a transfer student living in the dorms. And I, my parents lived in Simi Valley. And I remember going to the dining hall. And this is during the riots. And sitting down to eat. And some hippie girl who lived on the floor below me stood up and goes, "Mikhail's from Simi Valley," pointed at me. And I'm sitting there just thinking, all right, it's going to go down. And no one cared. They just kept eating. They looked at me for a second, they looked back at their food, and they just kept eating. It was this really strange moment where I guess she expected me to be run out of town on a rail or something, but it was just fascinating.
That's funny. And that's campus politics for sure. But that's also there was this perception that Simi Valley was just this place. It was just like the headquarters of the KKK, essentially. When really it seems like a more banal place than that.
It's where cops lived.
Yeah,
a lot of cops there. A lot of white cops.
Well, I think that's. I mean, I watched the documentary on the OJ thing, and they kind of do the LA riots as kind of a precursor to all of that, and they mentioned that's kind of. I think that was the motivation for moving the trial there. Yeah, it was a no lose proposition. It's so weird to be tied to this kind of weird history of LA when you're young and you don't really I look back at it now, I'm like, wow, that was really formative shit. I mean, those few years. Do you remember the Sublime song about the riots? And which was weird to listen to because it's like a white guy singing about it's really he's talking about killing cops and shit, and I just thought I didn't know what to think of it when I was young. Well, that was the MO of the whole band. Yeah. And there was the weird Long Beach kind of punk rappers, half white gangsters. Oh, you know what they had? I think they might have had a DJ spinning records in the back, right? We were just talking about that. Right. That's right. And I will propose that was originated in Ventura by Stalag 13, an hardcore band with the song "Do It Ride." Do It Ride. Check that song out. I think it's 1984. You said, or somewhere in there. They may have heard Buffalo Gals and went with it. But we associate this kind of I don't know, this '90s rap rock Limp Bizkit and then Linkin Park. I guess are rap rock a little bit. A little bit later, right? But this moment in pop culture where every rock band had a DJ in the background. But you have shown me that that notion may have started in Oxnard many years later. Wow. Cool. Well, thank you for this, David. This is great. I appreciate it. Learning from the locals. Okay, I want to thank my guest, Mikhail Gershovich. I had a great time talking to him. I always have a great time talking to him down at Emerson College in Hollywood, California. It's a whole new show here in California. I'm very much looking forward to talking to people that are out here in the sunshine, doing all the interesting things that I want to talk about on Nostalgia Trap, specifically academia, activism, communism, and the end of the world. So we have plenty more apocalyptic AM/FM episodes coming to you on the way as well. So thanks again for supporting the show. I really appreciate it. And if you haven't given me money, you should really think about that. I'm at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and you can find bonus episodes and all sorts of stuff if you pay into the club. So thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.